Dean Martin was in the middle of furs at Amore's when he saw a man collapse from a heart attack in the audience. What Dean did next, stopping the show to save a life, became the most heroic performance of his career. It was 9:43 p.m. on November 15th, 1969, and Dean Martin was performing his first show of the evening at the Copper Room in the Sands Hotel. The venue was packed with 400 guests, a typical Saturday night crowd of high rollers, tourists, and longtime fans who had come to see the King of Cool perform his signature mix of songs and casual charm. Dean was about halfway through his set, having just finished Everybody Loves Somebody to enthusiastic applause, when he transitioned into one of his most beloved numbers. The opening notes of That's Amore filled the room, and the audience settled in to enjoy one of Dean's classic performances. When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's Amore, Dean sang, his voice carrying easily through the intimate venue as he moved casually around the stage, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. It was during the second verse of the song that Dean noticed something unusual happening in the audience. About 15 rows back, near the center aisle, there was some kind of commotion. Dean could see people in that section, looking concerned and turning their attention away from the stage towards something happening at their tables. Dean continued singing, but his performer's instincts, owned by decades of reading audiences, told him that something was wrong. As he moved toward the front of the stage, he could see more clearly what was happening. A man in his early 60s, wearing a dark suit and sitting with what appeared to be his wife, had slumped forward in his chair. The woman beside him was trying to support him, calling his name and looking around desperately for help. When you dance down the street with a cloud at your feet, you're in love, Dean sang. But his attention was now completely focused on the unfolding emergency in his audience. Dean could see that the man was not responding to his wife's attempts to rouse him. The man's face had turned an alarming shade of grey, and he appeared to be unconscious. Other patrons at nearby tables were beginning to notice the situation, and Dean could hear worried voices calling for a doctor. Dean Martin had a choice to make. He could continue his performance and trust that someone in the audience or the hotel staff would handle the medical emergency. Most entertainers would have made that choice, understanding that stopping a show for an audience emergency was unprecedented and potentially problematic. Instead, Dean did something that shocked everyone in the Copper Room. He stopped singing mid-verse, set down his microphone, and announced to the stunned audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency. I need everyone to stay calm while we help this gentleman." The orchestra, confused by Dean's sudden interruption, gradually stopped playing. The Copper Room, which had been filled with music and conversation just moments earlier, became eerily quiet, except for the concerned voices coming from the area where the man had collapsed. Dean stepped off the stage and walked quickly through the audience toward the emergency. As he moved through the tables, people moved aside to let him pass, but they were clearly confused about what was happening and why Dean Martin was abandoning his performance. When Dean reached the table where the unconscious man was sitting, he could immediately see that the situation was critical. The man, whose name was later learned to be Robert Chen, a 62-year-old accountant from Los Angeles, was unconscious. His breathing was labored and irregular, and his skin color indicated that he was not getting adequate oxygen. "Sir, can you hear me?" Dean said, kneeling beside Chen's chair and gently shaking his shoulder. There was no response. Chen's wife, Margaret, was holding her husband's hand and crying. "I think he's having a heart attack," Margaret said through her tears. "He's been having chest pains all week, but he insisted on coming to see your show tonight. He's been a fan of yours for 20 years. Dean quickly assessed the situation. Chen was unconscious, His pulse was weak and erratic, and his breathing was becoming more shallow by the moment. Dean realized that this man was dying, and that immediate intervention was necessary if there was any chance of saving his life. What happened next surprised everyone who witnessed it, including Dean himself. Without hesitation, Dean began administering CPR. Very few people in the copper room that night knew that Dean Martin had extensive medical training. During World War II, Dean had served as a medic with the Army Air Forces, where he had learned advanced first aid, emergency medical procedures, and life-saving techniques. After the war, Dean had maintained his medical certification and had periodically updated his training, partly out of personal interest and partly because he felt a responsibility to be able to help people in emergency situations. Dean's medical knowledge had remained largely secret throughout his entertainment career. He had occasionally helped with minor injuries or medical situations, but always quietly and without publicity. Most of his friends and colleagues had no idea that behind his smooth entertainer persona was someone with genuine life-saving skills. Dean carefully moved Chen from his chair to the floor, positioning him on his back in the narrow space between the tables. Then, with the precision of someone who had performed the procedure many times, Dean began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dean counted aloud as he pressed rhythmically on Chen's chest, using the technique he had learned and practiced for over 25 years. The copper room was completely silent now, except for Dean's counting and the sound of his life-saving efforts. 400 people watched in stunned fascination as one of America's most famous entertainers worked desperately to save a stranger's life. After 30 compressions, Dean tilted Chen's head back, opened his airway, and began rescue breathing. The sight of Dean Martin performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on a dying fan was unlike anything anyone in the audience had ever witnessed. "Come on, Robert," Dean said between rescue breaths, having learned the man's name from his distraught wife. "Stay with us. You're going to be okay." Dean continued the CPR cycle, 30 compressions followed by 2 rescue breaths, while Margaret Chen knelt beside her husband, holding his hand and praying. Other audience members had formed a respectful circle around the emergency, some crying, others calling for additional medical help. After what seemed like an eternity, but was actually only about 3 minutes, Dean felt Chen's pulse strengthen slightly. A moment later, Chen's eyes fluttered open, and he began breathing more regularly on his own. "Robert," Dean said gently, "can you hear me?" Chen looked up at Dean with confusion and recognition. "Dean Martin?" he whispered weakly. "That's right, Robert," Dean replied with a smile. "You gave us quite a scare there." By this time, paramedics had arrived at the copper room and were preparing to transport Chen to the hospital. But the immediate crisis had passed, and it was clear that Dean's quick intervention had saved Chen's life. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Chen for transport, Dean spoke quietly with Margaret Chen. "Your husband is going to be okay," Dean told her. "He's stable now, and the paramedics will take good care of him." "Thank you," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving his life. I don't know what I would have done if—" "Don't think about that," Dean interrupted gently. "Robert is tough, and he's going to be fine, but he needs to see a cardiologist as soon as possible." When the paramedics had loaded Chen onto a stretcher and were preparing to leave for the hospital, Chen asked them to wait for a moment. He wanted to say something to Dean. "Mr. Martin," Chen said weakly, "I came here tonight because I've been a fan of yours for 20 years. But now you're my hero for a completely different reason." Dean knelt beside the stretcher and took Chen's hand. "Robert, You just focus on getting better. And when you're feeling stronger, I want you and Margaret to come back and see the show." As my guests, after the paramedics had taken Chen to the hospital, Dean faced a decision about what to do with the rest of his performance. The audience was still in the copper room, but the mood had obviously changed dramatically from the light-hearted entertainment atmosphere that had existed before the medical emergency. Dean returned to the stage and picked up his microphone. The audience applauded, but it was a different kind of applause, not the appreciation of entertainment, but the recognition of heroism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, his voice carrying more emotion than usual, "what we just experienced tonight reminds us that life is precious and unpredictable. Robert Chen came here tonight to hear some songs, but instead he taught all of us about what really matters." Dean paused for a moment, looking out at the audience that had just witnessed something extraordinary. "I'd like to dedicate the rest of tonight's show to Robert and Margaret Chen, and to all of you who showed such compassion and support during a frightening situation." Dean then did something unprecedented in his career. Instead of returning to his planned set list of upbeat songs and casual humor, he performed a series of deeply emotional ballads, including "The Way You Look Tonight" and "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," turning the remainder of the show into a tribute to the fragility and beauty of human life. The audience response was unlike anything Dean had ever experienced. There was no laughter, no casual applause, no typical nightclub atmosphere. Instead, there was a sense of shared experience, of having witnessed something profound together. When Dean finished his modified set, the audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. But this wasn't applause for entertainment. It was recognition for a moment when an entertainer had become something much more important. Frank Sinatra, who heard about the incident within hours, was amazed by Dean's actions. "I've known Dean for 20 years, Frank said, but I had no idea he had medical training. The fact that he used those skills to save a fan's life, that's beyond anything any of us do on stage." The story of Dean's life-saving intervention made headlines throughout the country. Though Dean tried to minimize the publicity, "I just did what anyone with medical training would do," Dean told reporters. "Robert needed help, and I was able to provide it. But Robert Chen, when he recovered from his heart attack, had a different perspective. Dean Martin didn't just save my life," Chen said in interviews. "He showed me that there are people in this world who will put another person's welfare ahead of their own career, their own image, their own comfort." The incident led to Robert Chen becoming not just a fan of Dean's music, but a lifelong friend. Dean and Margaret Chen maintained a relationship for years, with Dean checking on Robert's health, and the couple attending many of Dean's subsequent performances. Dean's medical intervention also inspired changes in how Las Vegas venues handled medical emergencies. The Sands Hotel began requiring all performers and staff to have basic first aid training, and other venues throughout the city followed suit. But perhaps the most significant impact of the incident was how it changed Dean Martin's own understanding of his role as a performer. From that night forward, Dean viewed his performances not just as entertainment, but as opportunities to connect with people on a deeper, more meaningful level. That night taught me that being on stage isn't just about singing songs, Dean reflected years later. It's about being present for people, being available to help when help is needed, and understanding that the relationship between performer and audience is about more than just entertainment. Dean Martin's decision to stop his show to save Robert Chen's life became one of the defining moments of his career, proving that the most important performances sometimes happen when the music stops and real life begins. If this story of life-saving heroism and putting others first moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who understands that real heroes are people who put human life ahead of everything else. Have you ever witnessed someone drop everything to help a stranger in crisis? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out our other videos about the moments when entertainers proved they were real-life heroes.